They called him a king, but behind the crown of Edward II of England hid a man torn between forbidden love, betrayal, and one of the most brutal punishments ever recorded in royal history. And what if I told you that the castration and death of the king's favorite were far more horrifying than the legends dare to describe? In the shadowy corridors of the 14th century, love was a crime, loyalty was poison, and the price of passion was paid in blood. Edward II was not the tyrant history painted him to be. He was a man who dared to love another man in an age when that love meant death. His favorite, Piers Gaveston, was not just a companion, he was the king's mirror, his muse, his downfall. The bond between them scandalized the court, enraged the nobles, and shook the church. When Edward showered him with jewels, lands, and titles, ignoring his queen, Isabella of France, it was not merely an act of defiance. It was a betrayal of the moral order of medieval England. Soon, whispers turned into conspiracies, and conspiracies into torture. The nobles captured Gaveston, mocked him, and led him to a hill outside Warwick. They cut off his head. But legend says something even more terrible happened before that. Something erased from official records but still whispered in the dark, that his body was mutilated, humiliated, desecrated. Edward's grief was uncontrollable. He wept like a child, kissed the remains, and swore vengeance against those who had destroyed the only man he ever loved. Years later, his new favorite, Hugh Despenser, would meet an even worse fate. Castrated and disemboweled, while Edward, now a prisoner, awaited his own slow, burning death. What really happened inside that dark cell in Berkeley Castle? Was he truly murdered with a red-hot iron bar inserted into his body, or was that part of the cruel myth written by his enemies? In this video, we're going to uncover the truth behind one of the most shocking love stories in royal history, one that mixed desire, cruelty, and politics into a tragedy England tried to erase. So before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, not just because it helps the channel grow, but because every interaction tells YouTube that stories like this deserve to be told. And stay until the end, because the final revelation will completely change the way you see King Edward II and the dark world that destroyed him. Imagine being born destined to rule an empire, but hating everything that empire stands for. That was Edward of Caernarfon, the man history would remember as Edward II of England. From his very first cry, he carried the weight of an inheritance he never asked for. The son of the fearsome Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, the young prince grew up in a world where strength was the measure of worth, where kings were judged by the number of battles they won, not by the depth of their feelings. But Edward was different, completely different. While other noble boys played with swords and trained to kill, he was enchanted by melodies, by the sound of harps, by the gentle touch of instruments, and by the quiet nights when he could draw or compose verses. The court didn't know how to deal with that. To them, sensitivity was weakness. But for Edward, it was the only way to breathe amid so much brutality. His father, the great warrior king, watched him with disappointment. He tried to mold him by force, quite literally. He placed him among knights, dragged him to military campaigns, and forced him to watch executions and battles. He wanted the young prince to learn to rule through fear, but Edward couldn't stand the sight of blood. It's said that after one campaign in the north, the prince fled the camp and was found weeping before the bodies of fallen soldiers. They had families too, he supposedly said. It was in that moment that his father realized his son would never be like him, and that was the beginning of the rift between them. Yet what many saw as weakness was, in truth, a rare kind of courage, the courage to be different in a world that demanded brutality. Edward grew up surrounded by rough men, but found comfort in friends who shared his more human view of life. He loved spending time with commoners, listening to their stories, laughing with musicians, and mingling with those his father deemed unworthy. He found beauty where the kingdom saw shame, And it was precisely that open and curious nature that brought him close to people who would change the course of his life, especially a certain young knight named Piers Gaveston. But before we reach that part, there's something important to understand. Edward was not only sensitive, he was stubborn. He believed deeply that love and loyalty should not be imposed by the sword, but earned through the heart. That belief made him unpredictable, almost poetic, but far too dangerous for royal standards. The court whispered, the councillors worried, and the old king, desperate, began to fear that the royal lineage itself was in danger. Chroniclers of the time wrote that Edward preferred to spend long nights at feasts, drinking wine, listening to musicians and reciting verses. These were not displays of power. They were gatherings of the soul. He was a man who wanted to feel, not to dominate. And for that reason, even before becoming king, he was already regarded with suspicion. People couldn't understand that behind that calm face was someone deeply divided. The son who wanted to please his father and the man who refused to become like him. That duality would follow him to his final days. And perhaps it was the seed of his downfall. As a young man, Edward learned the art of hiding who he truly was. He learned to smile during ceremonies, to say what was expected of him, to feign interest in military strategies. But inside, everything in him screamed for freedom. Freedom to be, to love, to live without fear. And it is precisely that silent cry that makes Edward II one of the most fascinating figures in English history. A man who never wanted power, but was forced to wield it, who was born to command armies, but only wanted to understand people. His tragedy began long before he ascended the throne. It began the moment the world decided that sensitivity was a sin and empathy was a weakness. Edward II did not fail for lack of strength, but for an excess of heart. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still speak of him. Because deep down, we all know what it feels like to live in a world that demands hardness when all we have inside is the longing to love and to be understood. And it's that contradiction, that soul that refuses to bow, that makes the story of Edward II so human, so painful, and so impossible to forget. When Piers Gaveston entered Edward II's life, something ignited inside the king, a flame that no one would ever be able to extinguish. Piers was not a noble by birth, nor an heir of blue blood. He was a Gascon knight from the south of France, with more charm than titles, more audacity than caution, and a spark in his eyes that seemed to challenge fate itself. He never asked for permission to enter, he simply did, and when he did, he left everyone breathless, including the heir to the English throne. Edward met him as a young man during one of his father's military campaigns, and the impact was immediate. Piers was everything he was not, confident, outgoing, witty, and strikingly handsome. While Edward hesitated to speak in public and avoided confrontation, Gaveston seemed to command any room with just a smile. They said that as soon as he opened his mouth, even his enemies forgot why they were there. But what began as admiration quickly became something far deeper, something that defied logic and, most of all, the rules of power. Edward saw in Piers not just a friend, but a reflection of the freedom he had always dreamed of having. By his side, he felt alive, whole, safe. It was as if, at last, someone understood him without the need for words. The problem was, the world wasn't ready for a love like that, the court whispered. The advisors watched with suspicion. His father, Edward I, grew furious when he noticed the intimacy between them. He saw in Piers a threat, a man without lineage, without political value, yet with far too much influence over the prince. And he was right. Gaveston had become the center of Edward's universe. When his father banished him from England, the prince cried and begged like a child, promising that he would bring him back the moment he became king. And he kept his promise. On the day Edward ascended to the throne, his first decision was neither political nor military. It was personal. He ordered Piers Gaveston to return. And not only that, he granted him titles, lands, jewels, and the title of Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious in England. To the nobility, it was the ultimate insult. To the Queen, a humiliation. To Edward, it was his way of saying to the world, "He is my chosen one." Piers didn't hide. He arrived at banquets in extravagant clothes, mocked powerful dukes and earls, and treated the court like a stage, with himself as the star. He was too bold for his time, and perhaps that's why his name has survived through the centuries. His beauty was legendary, but his sharp tongue earned him dangerous enemies. He called the Queen's uncle an old sheep, mocked the bravest knights, and made jokes about the most influential lords. Power went to his head, but the one feeding it was the king himself, blinded by love and fascination. Edward called him my brother, my heart, and wrote letters filled with tenderness that, to the church and nobility, bordered on scandal. Those documents survived, and today they are among the strongest pieces of evidence of a relationship history tried to erase. The king lavished him with clothes worth fortunes, golden necklaces, and even entire castles. He ignored his wife, Isabella of France, who watched everything with growing hatred. To her, Gaveston was not merely an intruder, he was a thief of hearts and power, and she was not alone. The entire parliament demanded that the king dismiss him, accusing him of corrupting the crown. But Edward refused. Piers was his refuge, his escape from loneliness and duty. When they were together, they laughed like teenagers, rode horses, played music, and traveled without escorts, something unthinkable for a monarch. It was love, yes, but also addiction, a kind of emotional dependence that grew stronger with every criticism and every threat. The more the world tried to tear them apart, the tighter Edward held on. But his love came at a price, and that price would be paid in blood. Piers's enemies began to gather. He was seen as the symbol of the throne's decay, the man who had turned the king into a slave of his emotions. And when love and power mix, the ending is never happy. One day, the royal council captured him and took him far from London. The king, desperate, tried to negotiate, begged, sent messengers, but it was too late. Piers Gaveston was to be executed. His mutilated body would be returned to the earth, and the king's heart would never be the same. The forbidden flame that once ignited England's throne was also the one that destroyed the man who lit it. And the worst part? Edward II would be forced to watch as the world turned the love of his life into a public disgrace. Yet even in tragedy, he never stopped calling him, in his letters and memories, my brother, my heart. A simple phrase, but one that still echoes today because no one, not even a king, can erase the memory of the love that made him feel alive for the very first time. She was called the She-Wolf of France. But before becoming one of the most feared queens in English history, Isabella was just a 12-year-old girl sent into a marriage she never chose. The daughter of the powerful King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, Isabella grew up surrounded by luxury, intrigue, and diplomacy. From an early age, she learned that royalty had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with strategy. When she was promised to the English prince Edward of Caernarfon, she believed she was sealing an alliance between two empires, France and England, and ensuring peace between two nations that had hated each other for generations. But when she crossed the English Channel and met the man she was meant to love, Isabella discovered that the real battlefield would be inside her own palace. Edward II was not the king she expected. He was kind, even gentle, but distant. His gaze always seemed to be searching for someone else, and that someone had a name: Piers Gaveston. Shortly after the wedding, Isabella realized she had been relegated to second place. The king preferred the company of the handsome Gascon knight and made no effort to hide it. During official ceremonies, Gaveston sat beside the throne, and the queen herself was ignored. Imagine the humiliation. A French princess, raised among kings and cardinals, treated as an ornament in her own court. The French nobility whispered, the English nobility fumed, and Isabella, in silence, learned the art of patience. She knew that in the game of power, patience was worth more than tears. She pretended to obey, but inside her grew something far more dangerous than wounded love, the desire for revenge, and that revenge would come in due time. When Gaveston was finally executed by the king's enemies, Isabella saw an opportunity. She offered comfort, feigned loyalty, and drew close to Edward with almost theatrical tenderness. For a moment, it seemed that the royal couple might start anew. They had children, attended ceremonies together, and Europe once again saw them as a stable monarchy. But it was an illusion. The void left by Gaveston was soon filled by another man, Hugh Despenser, a counsellor even more manipulative and ambitious. And once again, Isabella was pushed into the shadows. Only this time, she was no longer a girl. She was a grown woman, intelligent, cold and determined. Despenser not only stole the role of royal favourite, he seized control of the kingdom. He manipulated the king, confiscated lands, humiliated the nobles, and above all, dishonoured the queen. Accounts from the time say he treated her with disdain, barred her from castles, and even seized her personal income. The she-wolf began to awaken. The royal marriage turned into a prison. Isabella was watched constantly, her messengers intercepted, her children used as political pawns. But no one realized that she was already plotting her counterattack. During a diplomatic mission to France, sent by Edward himself, Isabella refused to return. There, she reconnected with Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman in exile, who was as disillusioned as she was. He had escaped from prison and hated the king as fiercely as she did. Between them grew a powerful and dangerous alliance. Chroniclers of the time swore that Isabella and Mortimer became lovers, united not only by passion, but by their shared desire to overthrow Edward II. While the king believed his wife was defending England's interests abroad, she was actually raising an army. In secret, Isabella and Mortimer recruited mercenaries, promised land and alliances, and in 1326 they landed on English soil with an armed force and a fury no one expected. The entire country turned against the king. Nobles, soldiers, and even Edward's old allies deserted him, joining the cause of the betrayed queen. The fall was swift. The man who had once been king and passionate lover found himself alone, fleeing from castle to castle, abandoned even by his guards. When he was captured, Isabella showed no mercy. She watched his imprisonment in silence, with the same cold gaze of someone observing the end of a play. At Mortimer's side, she took control of the government, proclaiming herself regent in the name of her son, the young Edward III. And so, the woman who had once been humiliated now ruled the empire that had scorned her. But power is a beast that devours those who feed it. Over time, Isabella realized that Mortimer wanted more land, more influence, perhaps even the throne itself. The she-wolf had fallen in love with her own hunter, and when her son came of age and took back control, he ordered Mortimer's execution and confined his mother to a castle. Even in captivity, Isabella kept her pride. She lived her final years surrounded by luxury and ghosts, visited by few, feared by many. It is said that until her death, she wore one pendant bearing the crest of France, and another with the emblem of England. Two worlds she had united and destroyed with the same icy precision. The queen who began as a submissive girl ended as the woman who brought down a king. Her story is a cruel reminder. In the royal court, love can be used as a weapon, and betrayal at times is merely another form of survival. And that is why Isabella of France was not just the she-wolf, she was the roar that changed the fate of an entire monarchy. The story of Edward II and his favourites is one of the most shocking and dark ever told about power, love, and revenge. When Piers Gaveston was executed in 1312, the king's heart broke in silence. He never recovered from that loss. He wept in public, refused to eat for days, and ordered monuments to be built in honor of the man the world called the shame of the crown. But the throne did not allow mourning. Time passed, and amid loneliness, Edward found another man, Hugh Despenser. Yet fate, cruel as ever, led him to repeat the same mistake. Hugh was different from Gaveston. If the first was charismatic and flamboyant, Despenser was calculating, cold and ambitious. It wasn't tea enough for him to be the king as favorite. He wanted to be the king in the shadows. And Edward, blinded by affection and emotional need, gave him everything. Estates, castles, titles, control over the kingdom's finances, and even power over the Queen herself. Despenser became the most hated man in England. His greed knew no limits. He seized nobles' lands, executed enemies, terrorized families, and humiliated anyone who dared to oppose him. The court whispered that Edward no longer ruled. It was Hugh who governed. The two were inseparable, and their bond provoked fury and disgust. To the king's enemies, Despenser was the true poison, corroding the throne. And in a way, he was. With him, the king plunged into tyranny, harshly punishing anyone who conspired against his rule. Prisons filled, executions multiplied, and England boiled with hatred. Even Queen Isabella, humiliated and isolated, began to see Despenser as the symbol of her personal hell. It was in this climate that the rebellion that changed everything was born. Led by Roger Mortimer, the Queen's lover, the nobles united under one promise: to destroy Despenser and end Edward's reign. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with an army from France. The people, tired of tyranny and corruption, received them as liberators. Edward and Hugh fled in desperation, hiding from castle to castle, but their fate was already sealed. They were captured near Neath in Wales. The Queen, cold as stone, ordered that the king's lover be judged immediately, with no defense, no mercy, no delay. The trial was a cruel performance. Hugh Despenser the Younger was accused of treason, blasphemy and sodomy, crimes that, in medieval England, meant certain death. But the death awaiting him defied imagination. On November 24, 1326, before a raging crowd, began one of the most brutal spectacles in history. First, Hugh was tied to a horse and dragged through the streets of Hereford as people spat, cursed, and threw stones. Then he was hanged, but the rope was cut before he died. Still breathing, he faced the second act. Before the crowd, his clothes were stripped off, and he was castrated. His genitals burned before his eyes. The smell of scorched flesh mixed with his screams, but the torment wasn't over. His abdomen was then slit open, and his intestines were pulled out slowly and thrown into the fire, while priests recited false prayers of forgiveness. Finally, his heart was torn out and shown to the crowd, a symbolic gesture. Here lies the heart of the traitor. His body was quartered and sent to the main cities of the realm as a warning. This is the price of loving a king. Edward II, imprisoned, was forced to hear every detail. Imagining what he felt is impossible. They say he remained silent for days, motionless, as if he had already died inside. The man who once ruled an empire was now reduced to a soulless prisoner, watching the world destroy the last fragment of love he had left. What began as passion turned into a nightmare that would stain his name forever. All of England celebrated Hugh Despenser's death, but deep down, that day was the funeral of something much greater, the end of Edward's humanity. After that, the king was taken to Berkeley Castle, where he would spend his final days surrounded by enemies, ghosts, and regrets. His fate would be as cruel as that of his lovers, but that part, the way he was killed, was so horrific that it still divides historians. Some say he was suffocated, others that he was burned alive from the inside out. And that is where the story descends completely into darkness, because the horror of a king who loved too deeply was still far from over. Imagine a king, a man who once ruled an empire, who loved, lost, and was betrayed, now locked in a damp cell, hearing nothing but the scurrying of rats and the echo of his own footsteps. This was the end of Edward II of England, the monarch who dared to love in a time when love itself was considered a sin. After his downfall, he was taken to Berkeley Castle, a grim fortress rising from the swamps and hills where the wind moaned like the cries of the damned. His imprisonment was not just punishment, it was psychological torture. The windows were sealed to block the sunlight. His food was rotten, the air stank of mold and iron, and the guards were ordered to keep him alive, but without hope. Edward, once surrounded by music and courtiers, now spoke only to himself, whispering names no one could understand. Perhaps Piers, perhaps Hugh, perhaps God, who had long stopped listening to his prayers. The chronicles of the time contradict one another, but they all agree on one thing: he was broken. The man who had loved simple pleasures and hated war died trapped in a labyrinth of hatred and revenge. His wife, Isabella, now ruled alongside her lover, Roger Mortimer, while the rightful king rotted in the dungeons. And this is where the mystery begins. One night, a messenger arrived at Berkeley bearing sealed orders from the Queen herself. The contents were never revealed. But that night, the peasants living nearby swore they heard screams coming from the castle, screams that chilled the blood. According to one of the darkest accounts, Edward was murdered in a way both symbolic and unspeakably cruel. The guards held him down and inserted a red-hot iron rod into his body, burning him from within. The act had a clear purpose: to destroy the body through the same sin that in the eyes of the church had condemned him. It was a ritual punishment, an execution meant to erase, through fire, the forbidden desire that had defined his life. Legend says he died without a scream, only tears running down his face as the smell of burnt flesh filled the cell. And yet others claim it was all a fabrication, that Edward's death was staged, an elaborate deception, and that he survived that terrible night. Some historians say they found secret documents, letters, seals, testimonies, suggesting the king escaped with the help of loyal monks and lived out his days hidden in a remote monastery far from the eyes of the court and the ghosts of his past. A Milanese monk years later wrote that he had sheltered a repentant English king who spent his days praying and carving small wooden crosses. Was it Edward? No one knows. But the theory gained strength because the body displayed after the supposed execution was seen by very few, and the coffin was hastily closed before the funeral. Even his son, Edward III, seemed to doubt his father's death. Years later, after ascending the throne and executing Mortimer, his mother's lover, the new king is said to have murmured a mysterious phrase: "What was buried at Berkeley was not my father." Those words reignited a question that still echoes through history. Did the king truly die at the hands of his executioners, or did he live on in obscurity, condemned to remember everything he had lost? Whatever the truth, the fate of Edward II became one of the greatest enigmas in English monarchy. What we know is that, real or not, the story of his death was written with the same fire that consumed him in life. The fire of desire, betrayal, and vengeance. And perhaps that is why it still fascinates us, because at its core, the legend of Edward II is not just about a king, but about anyone who dares to love against the rules. They say that on certain nights, when the wind blows through the ruined towers of Berkeley, one can still hear a faint voice, almost a whisper: "I loved, and for that I was burned." Truth or myth, one thing is certain: the heart of Edward II never left that castle, and perhaps it never will. For centuries, the name of Edward II was synonymous with weakness, scandal, and shame. Medieval chroniclers portrayed him as the king who failed, the man who traded the sword for affection, the throne for love. But time, relentless with some and generous with others, eventually turned the villain into a symbol, the scandal into a legacy, and forbidden love into a banner of courage. When the fog of prejudice began to lift, the world looked upon Edward II with new eyes. He was no longer the inept monarch described by his enemies, but a man who dared to feel in an age when feeling was a crime. A man who loved against his own crown, defied the church, tradition, and power to live a love that could not be named. In the 16th century, playwright Christopher Marlowe was the first to restore his humanity with the play Edward II. Writing in an era when homosexuality was still punishable by fire, Marlowe turned the king into a tragic, vulnerable, and deeply human figure. He did not paint the monarch as a fool, but as someone who lost everything because he refused to hide who he was. And that vision has been reborn many times, in theatre, literature, and film. In 1991, British filmmaker Derek Jarman, himself a gay man living through the AIDS crisis, transformed Edward II into a visual manifesto of resistance. Jarman fused medieval England with the modern world, showing riot police beating protesters, and turned the king's story into a cry against intolerance. The film was not only about a man from the past, but about all those in the present still punished for loving. Over time, Edward II became more than a historical figure. He became a mirror. Artists, writers, and activists began to see him as an early LGBTQ+ icon, someone who lived centuries before the words rights and freedom existed, yet already bore the weight of fighting for both. His love for Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser stopped being treated as scandal and became remembered as proof of humanity, that even a king can be enslaved by the heart. Modern historians, revisiting the records of his time, found more than political gossip. They found traces of tenderness, phrases of affection, letters that survived the centuries and revealed a sensitive man lost between duty and desire. What was once mocked is now studied as a symbol of emotional courage. Edward II, the king who was tortured, humiliated, and perhaps murdered for love, is now remembered as someone who paid the price of authenticity. His story inspires films, novels, and even operas, always echoing the same truth. He loved and was punished for it. And ironically, what his enemies tried to erase became immortal. The king the world sought to bury in silence is now celebrated as one of the earliest voices in the fight for acceptance. His name echoes in pride parades, on theatre stages, and in history books that finally free him from stigma. The love he lived, once seen as heresy, is now seen as heroism. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Edward II died more than 700 years ago, yet his heart still beats within the stories we tell. He was the king who could not wage war, the man who could not pretend, and the lover who dared to be vulnerable in a world that worshipped brutality. England tried to erase him, but instead turned him into legend. Today, he is remembered not for his weakness, but for his courage to feel. Fate punished him with exile, pain, and fire, but history absolved him. And perhaps that is true power, when time transforms suffering into symbol and love into legacy. Edward II is, in essence, the portrait of everything that makes us human: fear, desire, loneliness, and the need to be accepted. His story is a mirror where each of us can see ourselves, because we've all had to hide something just to be accepted. And that's why, centuries later, we still speak of him. Because love, when it is true, never dies. It merely changes form, crosses time, and keeps telling its story through the voices of those who still dare to love. Now, before this video ends, I have one request. If you've made it this far, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It may seem small, but on YouTube, it means everything. Every like, every comment, every subscription tells the platform that content like this, that shares real human emotional stories, deserves to be seen by more people. Your engagement is what keeps this work alive. And I want to know, what did you think of Edward II's story? Do you believe he was a victim of love or of circumstance? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them all and love knowing what you think. And before you go, don't leave just yet. Watch the video appearing now on your screen. If this story has held your attention until now, the next one will surprise you even more. It is one of the most emotional and powerful tales I've ever shared on this channel, and I promise its ending will leave you breathless. So click now and continue this journey with me through the most human and most forbidden side of history.